I said I'd share a few thoughts on the white paper. I've read quite a lot of it. I've read a lot of the coverage around it, and I've read a lot of your comments on the videos I made yesterday. A few thoughts. First of all, this new 3-tiered model, targeted plus, specialist. Well, if you are a teacher of a certain vintage, you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, didn't this used to just be support plus, and statement? We've been here before. And it's another example of how things in education just will eventually come full circle. Now, let's start with some of the positives. So all the talk about early intervention, I completely agree with. I think most of you do, that it's the right direction. The earlier we step in, the less likely things are to spiral. It just makes sense. No one wants a crisis-led, reactive system. We want it to be more proactive. So having access to specialists more quickly, spot on, clearer national expectations, potentially good. Try and reduce the postcode lottery is needed. However, and this is where the tone of your comments really shifts, there is a lot of trepidation, a lot of apprehension. And honestly, I get it. When you've worked in a system, or you're a parent in a system that's been under so much financial pressure for the best part of a decade, when you've seen reforms come and go, when you've been told this time it'll be different over and over, it's natural to just not have that trust or be very, very wary. And a lot of comments suggest people feel this just could be more of the same. A lot of people thinking it's just a cost-cutting exercise dressed up as reform, tightening the HCP thresholds, pushing more children into mainstream because that'll be cheaper. Now, I don't necessarily agree that this is the intention, right? The funding is significant. I think the ambition on paper is a step in the right direction because we know the current system is not working. We all know that. But the trust has to be earned. And this is why the devil for me is really going to be in the details, because what actually counts as a complex need? Where is the threshold for EHCPs? Who decides when mainstream has done enough? Because if EHCPs become harder to secure, even subtly, and more children are supported in mainstream, then that clarity is everything. Otherwise, mainstream will just absorb more complexity without the right provisions, support, or people. There's quite a few concerns in the comments around these inclusion bases in every school, saying, well, it's not really inclusion if children are just taken into another room. Some people just point blank said you can't get inclusion in mainstream. And that's not because people don't believe in inclusion as like a philosophy thing. They see it as a capacity problem. Inclusion works when it's properly resourced, smaller ratios, properly trained staff, protected time for intervention, and genuine access to specialists, which is what leads me to my biggest concern with this whole white paper, and so many others are the same: the workload. You know, teachers are reading it thinking, this sounds like more plans, more documentation, more monitoring, more accountability. And inclusion doesn't fail because teachers don't care. It fails because there isn't enough time and there aren't enough adults in the room, which brings me to something that was severely lacking in the white paper. There was no mention at all about teaching assistants. They barely featured. Yet in reality, they're often the reason inclusion works at all. And when you look over the past few years at how schools have had to cut TAs due to budget pressures, provision has suffered massively. That link is obvious to anyone who actually works in a classroom. And you can write the most beautiful framework in the world, but people make the difference. And none of this will work unless TAs and support staff are valued, invested in, and trained effectively. Now, we know the retention with TAs and support staff's not great, but then we've got the retention crisis in teaching, which, looking at what some of these reforms will do as far as workload, isn't going to help the situation. Yet the only mention in this white paper is about recruiting 6,500 teachers, but we're still losing 40,000 teachers a year. And that's not going to get any better if workload increases because of all these new systems laid on top of old ones. When will the government realise that you cannot keep pouring into a bucket that is constantly leaking? None of these reforms will stick if retention doesn't improve. And you've got to look at the other workforce capability, like where are all these ed sites coming from? Where are all the therapists coming from? Because in so many areas, the waiting lists are already ridiculous. And there's one point that a lot of people talked about, which is this idea that every school has to join a MAT. The idea that every school needs to be in a trust isn't filling people with much confidence when there's a real concern about how funding flows through the CEO's pay packet before it goes into classrooms. Look, in conclusion, the ambition is right because we know things aren't working, things need to change. The mention of early intervention, family hubs, absolutely. Better collaboration makes sense. But success is going to hinge on three things. We need that clarity around complex needs. We need serious investment in people, support staff. That 4 billion needs to go to the right places, and workload cannot increase for an already stretched profession, because we've had big SEND reform before, but this time it will only work if the system underneath it is strong enough to carry it. And it's not strong enough at the minute. It's barely surviving without anything new being added.